Bible with you, you got the Bible app on your phone, Luke 23 is where we will be this morning. If you don't have a Bible with you, all the verses will be on the screens here, and you can follow along with us there. As your pastor, and really as your new pastor, there is something that I need to confess to you guys, and that is that you hired a complete idiot as your pastor. I hate to break the news to you, but that is true. I am an idiot. And as an idiot, I am regularly finding myself in situations where I do something dumb and I have to stop and say I'm sorry and ask for forgiveness. Right? Like just a couple weeks ago, we were driving the kids somewhere here in town, and we were at an intersection. We're stopped at a red light, and my light turns green. I start to kind of go and pull into the intersection, and there are several cars that ignore their now red light and keep going through the intersection. Right now, again, I've got all 4 kids in the car, my wife's in the car, so I kind of turn into like the crazy protective Papa Bear. I start blasting my horn, I'm yelling out the window, I'm like, what are you doing? You're going to kill my kids. You know, like they're not running the yellow light, they are just completely ignoring the red light. So I'm freaking out, I'm losing my mind, and as I'm freaking out and losing my mind, I notice there are more cars that continue coming and going through the red light. And then I notice there's a couple police officers on motorcycles sitting at the red light. And then, no kidding, this happened, I turn and I look and I notice the first car that went through the red light was a hearse. Yeah, it's okay. You can laugh at how dumb I am. It's okay. I realize that I am honking and yelling at a funeral procession. And I just melt into my seat. I'm like, oh my goodness, I am the worst human being in the world. I am off. I'm like, guys, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. It's not your fault. It's my fault. Please forgive me. Right now, hopefully you're not as dumb as me and do something like that, but we all find ourselves in situations, right, where we do something and we realize we've made a mistake. We have to stop and we have to ask for forgiveness. And that's never easy to do, is it? I mean, coming to the point where we humble ourselves and we have to realize that we have done something wrong and asking for forgiveness, that's tough. But not only is it tough because we have to humble ourselves, it's also tough because we don't know how the person we have to ask for forgiveness from is going to respond. You know, we're not sure if they're going to kind of throw it back in our face. We're not sure if they're going to accept our apology, and that makes it difficult to ask for forgiveness. But the good news that we are going to see in the book of Luke this morning is that God, the creator of the universe, at his very core of who he is a God who delights in showing mercy and forgiveness. God is not a God that we have to worry to about approaching for forgiveness. He actually delights in forgiveness. Right? Maybe some of you grew up in kind of a religious church tradition where your mindset, your perspective of God was that God was somewhat like this cosmic police officer who had this speed trap set up, and he was just constantly watching you, hoping to catch you go 5 over the speed limit so he could write you the most expensive ticket possible. Right, some of you, that's been the picture of God that you grew up with. He's a God who was just waiting to catch you in the wrong so he can punish you. But again, what we're going to see today is that God is not a God who delights in punishment. He is a just God, but he doesn't delight in punishment. God is a God who delights in mercy and in forgiveness. So today we're kicking off this new series called Famous Last Words that is going to take us through Easter Sunday. And each week of this series, we're going to be looking at one of the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, and we're going to be looking at and examining the last words that Jesus said on the cross. As Jesus is suffering, dying on the cross, taking the sin of mankind onto himself, the gospel authors actually record the words that he says before his death. Now what's interesting is the first phrase, the first saying of Jesus from the cross that we're going to see this morning is not something that he said to other people. It was actually something that he said to God the Father. It was a prayer. And what's fascinating about this prayer of Jesus from the cross is that it wasn't a prayer for himself. Although if you think about it, while he was suffering a brutal, horrible death on the cross, he had every right to pray for himself. He had every right to pray for relief of the suffering that he was experiencing. But he doesn't do that. We're going to see in this prayer, he's actually praying for others. He's praying for the people who are literally murdering him. He's praying for the people in the crowds who are mocking him. And ultimately, he's praying for you and I. So Luke 23, we'll pick it up in verse 32. This is what Luke writes. He says, 2 others, both criminals, were led out to be executed with Jesus. And when they came to a place called the Skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So the first thing that Jesus says on the cross is this prayer where he prays and he says, Father, forgive them. Again, he's saying, Father, forgive those who have put me here. Forgive the soldiers who nailed me to the cross. Forgive those in the crowd who are walking by and mocking. And again, ultimately, he's praying that you and I, through his death and subsequent resurrection, that we too will find forgiveness. Now, here's kind of the big idea, the big picture that we're going to be looking at today about what this prayer teaches us. If you're writing notes, I'd encourage you to write this down. But what this prayer of Jesus from the cross shows us is that you and I, we are more guilty than we want to believe. I know that's not good news, but we got to understand this. We are more guilty than we want to believe. But at the same time, we are more loved than we could ever hope. Okay, what this prayer of Jesus shows us is we're more guilty than we want to believe, but we are at the same time more loved than we would ever hope. So first, it shows us we're more guilty than we want to believe. Right? The Apostle Paul, later in the New Testament, he would write that the cross is an offense. Right? He basically says the message of the cross and the crucifixion is offensive. Now, growing up hearing that verse, I always thought that was so weird. Like, why would Paul say that the cross is offensive? But the reason that Paul says the cross is offensive is because the message of the cross basically says that you and I are so guilty that the perfect, righteous, holy Son of God had to die on the cross for us to be forgiven. That's how guilty we are, that Jesus had to die to secure our forgiveness. And the thing that we're guilty of is this thing that you've heard before, the Bible calls sin. And sin is essentially cosmic treason against the God of the universe. It's anything we say or think or do where we basically with our actions say, God, I know better than you. I don't need you. I can kick you off your throne and I can sit on the throne. I can be my own God. That's what sin is. And the Bible says we're all guilty of that. And because of our guilt of that, we deserve death. And so again, Paul wrote 2,000 years ago that message that you and I are guilty and deserve death, that's an offensive message. Now, I think we all realize that today in our culture, that message is even more offensive now than it was 2,000 years ago, right? Because we're in a culture now where we all want to believe that we're good people, don't we? We all want to believe that human beings, by our nature, at our core, are ultimately good. And so we try to justify all of our actions. Right? We say things like, oh, well, I'm not a liar. I just tell a lie every now and then. Right? Like, how silly is that? How ridiculous is that? We want to justify ourselves. We want so badly to be self-righteous. But the message at the core of the cross of Jesus is that it is futile for us to be self-righteous, that trying to find goodness in ourselves is futile. The cross shows just how deep the poison of sin goes into the human heart. Right? The problem of sin was so large and so deep that the perfect Son of God, who was sinless, had to die for us to be forgiven. And now, by the way, before we move on, for those of you who are here and you're Christians, if you're watching online, you're a Christian, you're a follower of Jesus, this reality should lead us to always be humble in our interactions with non-Christians. Right? This reminds us that we should never, for a moment, think that we are better than anybody. Right? To be a Christian at the core means that you believe that you were so bad, that your heart was so dark and so turned from God, that God himself put on flesh, lived a perfect life, and died in your place. Right? So how could we believe that in our hearts and ever look down on somebody else for their sin and their struggle? Right? We should be a humble people because this prayer of Jesus reminds us just how guilty we were, how guilty we stood before God. But again, at the same time, the good news of this prayer is that it reminds us just how loved we really are. Because we see through this prayer that God loved you and I so much that there was not a depth that He would not descend to in order to offer His forgiveness to us. Right? God is not a begrudging forgiver. Now, you know what I mean? Because some of y'all married folks, if you're honest, you're a begrudging forgiver, aren't you? Right? And don't be elbowing your spouse, okay? It's not going to go well for you, I promise. But some of you, your spouse does something that ticks you off. They've been driving you crazy all week, and then they come and they say they're sorry. What do you say? Well, okay, I forgive you, but I'm not very happy about it. Right? We're begrudging forgivers. Or if you're a parent, you're definitely a begrudging forgiver, especially about a year ago when lockdown started. If you had to homeschool your kids, right? I was there, I get it. You were stuck inside with your kids 24/7 for a month. They're driving you insane. They're going crazy. And so every time they come and say, Mom, Dad, I'm sorry, you're like, I'm sick of you saying sorry. Like, I am tired of having to forgive you. Will you just knock it off? Right? That's how we are, isn't it? We are oftentimes begrudging forgivers. But again, the good news is God is not a begrudging forgiver. When we come to God for forgiveness, God's not up in heaven saying, like, really? You're coming again? You just asked yesterday, and now you've got to ask again. Man, I'm kind of getting tired of forgiving you. That's not who God is. Paul, the way he would put it later in the New Testament is, he said that God is rich in mercy. Think about that statement. God is rich in His mercy. Paul basically says that God is like the Bill Gates or the Jeff Bezos of mercy. Right? Like, He's got more mercy than He could ever spend. And He is not stingy with His mercy. He's just looking for a place to spend it. God delights in showing mercy and forgiveness. See, if you read the commentaries on this passage, what's interesting is that people who have studied these verses in the original language say that when Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they say that Jesus says that phrase in the imperfect tense. Now, I'll be honest with you guys. English is my first language, and English is my only language, but I'm still not very good at English. Okay, I didn't do great in school. My motto was always C's, earn degrees. So I have no idea what an imperfect tense is. I don't know what that means. But I've got books written by people who are smarter than me, and they know what it means. And what they say is that a word in the imperfect tense, it basically means and implies a continual action in the past. It implies and it refers to something that happened continually in the past. Not just once, but continuously. And so what that means is that leading up to the cross and on the cross, Jesus didn't just pray, Father, forgive them once. This means that Jesus was continually and constantly praying, Father, forgive them. What this is showing us, what the text is implying, that as the guards were whipping His back, Jesus was praying, Father, forgive them. As they took that crown of thorns and drove it into His skull, Jesus was praying, Father, forgive them. As they nailed His hands and His feet to the wooden beams, Jesus was praying, Father, forgive them. As they lifted up the cross and dropped it into the ground and those nails tore through the nerve endings in His arms and in His legs, Jesus prayed, Father, forgive them. And as the crowds walked by and spit on Him and mocked Him, Jesus was praying, Father, forgive them. And the point is that if Jesus was continually and constantly praying for the forgiveness of the very people who were unjustly torturing and murdering Him, how foolish would it be for any of us to ever think that we are too far gone to experience the forgiveness of God? How foolish would it be to ever say, well, I've done fill in the blank. How could God ever forgive me? Again, if the very people who are unjustly murdering Jesus, He prayed for their forgiveness, You and I, we are never too far gone for God's forgiveness. Listen, if you're here, you're watching online, and you've got all this guilt and all this shame from things that you've done or maybe even are currently doing, you're like, I just don't know if God could ever forgive me. Listen, you're not that special. That's good news. You are not that special. You are not that unique. You don't happen to be the one person in the history of the universe who was too far gone for God. That's not you. The prayer of Jesus is showing us that God's love for us is so deep and so vast that His forgiveness is offered to anyone at any time for anything. Now, as this passage goes on, the second saying of Jesus that we see here in the same chapter, it shows us what we have to do to enter into that forgiveness. You remember back in verse 32, it said that as Jesus was being crucified on both sides of him, there were two other criminals being executed, being crucified along with him. Now, you got to understand that these criminals, the original language implies that these were violent criminals. These weren't people who, say, broke into a bank at night, stole some money, but no one was hurt, and insurance paid for it, and it was a victimless crime. That's not the situation. These were violent criminals. The picture of the text is that these are the kind of guys that break into a home at night, beat the family to death, and take everything that they own. Those are the kind of people that are being crucified alongside of Jesus. And as they're hanging there, the text tells us that one of the criminals, he joins in with the crowds and he begins mocking Jesus. But this is what it says the other criminal says in verse 40. It says, "But the other criminal protested, 'Don't you fear God even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man hasn't done anything wrong.' Then he said, 'Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' And Jesus replied, 'I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise.'" This second criminal, he acknowledges his guilt. He acknowledges that he is getting what he deserves. He acknowledges his sin. And then he acknowledges that Jesus is who he says he is. That he is the perfect Son of God who has done nothing wrong, who is sinless, who is paying for the sins of others. And because of that acknowledgement of his guilt and his confession that Jesus is who he says he is, Jesus looks at him and says, "Your sin is forgiven." He says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Notice that this man finds forgiveness the moment he acknowledges his sin and acknowledges the lordship of Jesus. I love this because when this man looks at Jesus and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom," basically, "Jesus, forgive me." When he does that, Jesus doesn't turn and look to him and say, "Hey, buddy, I'm glad you finally realized your need for me. I'm glad you're finally admitting everything you've done wrong, but hey, it's a little late. You're late to the party. You're an hour or so away from death, and we've got to talk about everything you've done and make sure you really understand." Jesus doesn't do that. The moment this man acknowledges his guilt and confesses that Jesus is who he said he was, Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise. Today your sin is forgiven." And what we learn there is that in order for us to experience that same forgiveness, all we have to do is acknowledge our need for it and believe that Jesus is who he said he was. That he is the perfect Son of God who on the cross paid for our sin. And we see here through this story, through the words of Jesus, that when we do that, when we acknowledge our guilt and our sin, and we believe that Jesus took it on to himself, we receive the forgiveness of God. And we see here that forgiveness is immediate and permanent, and it's final. That when you and I receive that forgiveness, it's for all of our sin, past, present, and future. That's how Paul in Romans could write that through Jesus there is now nothing left that could ever separate us from the love of God. Through Jesus, all of our sin is paid for, and now nothing can separate us from the love of God. So as we close, just two responses today, two ways for us to respond. First of all, if you're here today, if you're watching online and you are not yet a Christian, you're not yet a follower of Jesus, or maybe you're not sure if you are. Maybe you're here today and you're not quite sure if your sin is forgiven. You're not sure that if you stood before God today, your sin would be forgiven and you would live forever with God in heaven, in His kingdom. If you don't know the answer to that, today, the response for you is to receive this forgiveness. It's to accept the forgiveness of God. And again, the good news is you don't have to do anything to earn it, because we couldn't earn it. Jesus earned it on the cross for you and I. He secured our forgiveness. So just like this criminal on the cross, all that's left for us to do is acknowledge our guilt and trust that Jesus paid it all. That's all that's left for us to do. And if that's you and you're here today or you're watching online and you've never received that free gift of forgiveness, then man, don't leave here today without receiving that. And by the way, if that's you and you need to receive that, we want to know. We're not going to make you walk up here and put you on the stage and do anything to embarrass you, but we want to know so that we can be praying for you, so that we can celebrate with you, and so that we can just follow up with you and walk alongside of you as you begin to walk with Jesus. And so if that's you and today you need to receive the forgiveness of God, that little card that Pastor Carlos talked about earlier that's in your seat back, just fill that out. On the back of it, there's a box that said, I would like more information on following Jesus. Just check that box, and as you leave, drop it in one of the boxes in the lobby. And again, we would love to just pray for you and follow up with you this week and answer any questions that you may have. But if you're here today and you've never received the forgiveness of God, all that's left for you to do is accept it. Don't leave here today without doing that. So that's the first response. But the second response is for those of you who are already followers of Jesus. You know that you've already received the forgiveness of God. The response for you is simple. It's to remember that you're forgiven. All right, that's it. Remember that you are forgiven. Because let's be honest, it's easy to forget, isn't it? It's easy to walk through life with shame. It's easy to walk through life covered with guilt. It's easy to look back on our past at all the mistakes that we've made, all the things that we wish we would have done different. It's easy to carry those on our shoulders with this burden of shame. Listen, shame is not from God, it's from the enemy. If you are forgiven, Jesus took all of that onto His shoulders on the cross. There's no reason for you to carry it any longer. And so if you're a follower of Jesus, but you're still dealing with guilt and with shame from your past, remember that you're forgiven. Remember that your debt was paid. Remember that now when God looks at you, He doesn't see your sin. He sees the perfect, holy righteousness of His Son, Jesus. Right? That's what the Bible says, that through Christ we are clothed in the righteousness of Christ. That the Father doesn't see our sin any longer. He sees the righteousness of His Son. So let go of your guilt. Let go of your shame. You can't change the past, and Jesus already paid all of that for you. Remember that you are forgiven. Let me pray for us.